My name is Captain Maya Reeves, and I'm 29 years old. In the United States Air Force, there is one truth every pilot learns before they ever leave the ground. The sky does not negotiate. It doesn't care about your rank, your politics, or the size of your ego. It only respects skill. But on the first morning I walked into the Operations Center at Joint Base Langley Eustis, General Douglas Harlan made it perfectly clear that he operated by a different set of rules entirely. There were 32 officers in that briefing room. I know the exact number because I counted them, the way I always counted instruments on a pre-flight check, methodical, deliberate, keeping my nerves controlled beneath the surface. I had just transferred in from Bagram, carrying 2 commendations, a combat action ribbon, and a call sign that had a reputation of its own. What I didn't carry, apparently, was the right last name or the right set of anatomy for this particular command. I had barely finished presenting my tactical integration proposal, a detailed framework for coordinating close air support with ground units in contested airspace, when the general set down his coffee mug with a deliberate, measured thud. He didn't look at my slides. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's decided doesn't belong in the room. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying the easy, unhurried authority of a man who had never once been interrupted in his life. That was a very enthusiastic presentation. A low ripple of knowing laughter moved through the room. But I think we can all agree that this command doesn't run on enthusiasm. He paused, letting the silence settle like a sentence. "When you've actually logged some real combat hours, maybe then we'll revisit the theory." I had 468 combat flight hours. That number was in my file, a file he had clearly never opened. I didn't move. I kept my chin level and my hands loose at my sides. A knot tightened in my throat, but I swallowed it back down the same way I had swallowed G-force on a hard brake turn, by breathing through it, by staying in the cockpit, by refusing to let the aircraft win. He didn't know what those hours had cost me. He didn't know what I'd brought back from the Euphrates Valley on a November night 3 years ago, or what call sign I'd earned for doing it. He would. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt every single one of them decide, in the same instant, that you don't belong there, leave a comment below and let me know. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next changed not just my career, but the entire culture of the command I was standing in. The walk back to my temporary office afterward was long. Langley had that particular brand of institutional, quiet, polished floors, fluorescent light, the distant sound of aircraft on the flight line that should have felt like home. It didn't. I passed 2 pilots I'd been introduced to that morning. Both of them became suddenly, intensely interested in the bulletin board to their left. Neither one said a word. The office they'd assigned me was a repurposed storage room at the far end of the administrative corridor, wedged between the supply closet and a broken copier that no one had bothered to replace. It had 1 desk, 1 chair, and a ventilation duct that rattled every time the heat kicked on. I sat down, folded my hands on the desktop, and looked at the blank wall in front of me. My father used to say that the worst thing you can do in turbulence is let go of the stick. He wasn't a pilot, he was a high school history teacher in Clarksville, Tennessee. But he understood pressure in the way that quiet men sometimes do. When the noise gets loudest, he'd tell me, that's exactly when you hold on tightest. I held on. The isolation that followed was not loud. It was architectural. It was built into the structure of every day in small, precise acts of exclusion. At the morning briefings, my assessments were received with the same polite, vacant expression one might give to a weather forecast for a city you had no intention of visiting. During a joint planning session in my second week, I watched Lieutenant Colonel Preston take 3 of my recommended ingress coordinates, fold them into his own briefing, and present them to the general with the quiet confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of being caught. Harlan leaned forward, put a hand on Preston's shoulder. "That's the kind of initiative this squadron needs," he said. Preston caught my eye for exactly 1 second. The expression on his face wasn't guilt, it was satisfaction. That Friday, the pilots gathered at Hangar Bar, a dive 20 minutes off base with a signed S-16 photo above the door and beer that came in buckets. It was the unofficial inner circle. The place where real decisions got made between rounds, where the social architecture of the unit was quietly assembled and maintained. I was not invited. I drove past the parking lot on my way home and saw their cars lined up in the gravel, and I kept driving. That night, eating leftover Thai food alone in a furnished apartment that still smelled like the previous tenant's candle, my phone rang. Unknown number, area code 505. "Reeves," I said. "Captain." The voice was warm, unhurried, and immediately familiar. "It's Torres, Staff Sergeant Dominic Torres. My crew chief from Bagram, the calmest human being I had ever watched function under mortar fire. Taurus, I said, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 2 weeks simply released. How did you get this number? You gave it to me, he said. Before you left. Said to call if anything came up. A pause. Nothing came up. I just heard you landed at Langley. Wanted to make sure you're all right. Those guys eat people alive over there, Captain. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. To hear my name without the word sweetie or enthusiastic attached to it. To be called captain by someone who knew exactly what that rank had cost. It was oxygen. I'm fine, I said. The lie tasted like chalk. We talked for 20 minutes about the flight line at Bagram, about the new maintenance rotations, about his daughter's soccer tournament. When we hung up, the apartment was quieter than before. But the silence had a different quality to it. It wasn't empty, it was holding something. The manila envelope appeared on my desk on a Monday morning, slid under the door sometime before 6. No name, no return address. Inside was a single printed page, a redacted incident summary from something called Operation Cold Meridian. Whole paragraphs had been blacked out with a heavy marker, but circled in red ink, 3 times, was a single phrase that had survived the redaction, pilot assessment disputed at command level. At the bottom of the page, in block letters so small they were almost invisible, you're not the first one they've done this to. You're not the first one they've done this to. DP. DP. I went through the unit roster in my head. Lieutenant Dana Park. She sat in the back row of every briefing with a yellow legal pad and wrote everything down. I had noticed her because she was the only other woman in the room, and because she never once looked at me with pity. She looked at me the way an engineer looks at a load-bearing problem, with focus and calculation. I found her at the coffee station at 062D the next morning, before the rest of the floor had filled in. You slid something under my door, I said quietly. She didn't look up from her mug. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Then, after a beat, but I eat lunch at the civilian food court on Settlers Landing Road, noon. The corner booth. She walked away. I watched her go. We met 4 more times over the following 2 weeks. Dana was a logistics officer, which meant she had access to the kind of administrative layers that most pilots never thought about. Supply chains, maintenance records, transfer authorizations. She was also, I discovered, exceptionally angry in the quiet and methodical way of someone who had been angry for a very long time and had simply learned to do it efficiently. Harlan has been here 6 years, she told me over coffee, her eyes steady, her voice low. 3 pilots had transferred out under unusual circumstances during that time. All of them raised operational safety concerns. All of them ended up at remote postings within 90 days of doing so. She slid a small notepad across the table. Operation Cold Meridian was 18 months ago. A 2-ship close air support mission over eastern Syria. 1 aircraft went down, the pilot didn't make it. I read the name on the notepad. Captain James Okafor. 27 years old. Grew up in Atlanta. What happened? I asked. That's the part that's been redacted, Dana said. But the unit flight surgeon filed a report that was never formally acknowledged. And Okafor's crew, the ones who survived, were separated and reassigned within a month. Different bases. Different time zones. She looked at me. No one talked to anyone. She paused. They're watching us. Be careful. What I found when I finally started looking was not in any classified system. It was in the physical archives, a building at the edge of the installation that housed paper records going back 40 years. Managed by a civilian archivist who went home at 4:30 every afternoon. I had legitimate access for routine file reviews. I used it. The Cold Meridian file had been administratively sanitized. That much was obvious the moment I opened the secondary binder. The gaps were too regular, the redactions too comprehensive. But my father had been a historian before he was a teacher, and he'd spent years working with primary source documents. He taught me something I had never expected to actually use. The mechanical imprint of a ballpoint pen on paper doesn't disappear just because the ink on top of it does. On the 3rd night, working alone with a small flashlight and a piece of drafting paper I'd borrowed from the map room, I found it. A communications log entry time-stamped at 21,047 local, 43 minutes before Okafor's aircraft went down. Most of the text was blacked out, but the pressure of the original pen had left ghost letters in the paper beneath. I shaded across the surface slowly. The letters came up one at a time. YUX degrading. Recommend abort. Okafor. Below it, in a different hand, negative. Continue mission. CDR. I sat back against the cold metal shelf and let the full weight of it settle. There was only one person who held commander authority over Cold Meridian that night. I pulled up the mission authorization chain on my phone. General Douglas Harlan. He had overruled Okafor's abort recommendation. James Okafor had told his commander the weather was too dangerous to continue, and Harlan had ordered him to press forward anyway. 43 minutes later, Okafor was dead. And then Harlan had buried the record. The systematic campaign to discredit me, the public dismissals, the stolen work, the deliberate exclusion, it had never been about me at all. I was new, I was asking questions, and I flew the same kind of missions Okafor had flown. I was a liability to a cover-up that was 18 months old and still fragile. What I didn't know then was that my late nights in the archive had tripped something. The building had a passive access log that I hadn't thought to check. By the time I walked back to my car on the fourth night, the system had already sent a flag. Dana called me at 05:30 the next morning, her voice tight and controlled. I got orders, she said. I already knew what was coming. Where? Elmendorf, Alaska. Effective in 72 hours. The paperwork says operational requirement. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Maya, they know. Whatever you found, you need to move fast. The line went dead. Clean, surgical. Not a dropped call. I went back to the archive that night. I needed photographs of the communications log, hard copies I could take out of the building. But when I reached the cold Meridian binder and turned to the page I'd shaded, I found a blank space where the communications log had been. The page was gone, not misfiled, renummed. The file had been accessed after me, and whoever had done it was faster and more thorough than I had counted on. I stood in that cold, humming room for a long time. Then I turned around and walked out. The security escort was waiting at my office at 0700. 2 of them in service dress. They informed me, with the polished impersonality of people executing a process rather than a decision, that I was to surrender my access credentials and all government-issued devices pending a formal inquiry under Article 92 for unauthorized access of restricted materials. Through the glass partition, I could see the flight planning room. The pilots inside watched me be escorted out with the careful peripheral attention of people who have learned that looking directly at consequences is dangerous. I was restricted to quarters pending the inquiry date. The investigation had a 2-week timeline. I used it. The first thing I did was write down everything I remembered, every detail of the communications log, every date, every name, every redaction pattern. Handwritten, on paper, in my apartment. The second thing I did was call my father. I didn't tell him the specifics. I told him I was facing a decision about a superior officer and that the right answer and the safe answer were not the same thing. And I didn't know how to reconcile that. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the television on low in the background, the news, the way he always kept it, a low background hum of the world going about its business. Maya, he said finally, you remember what I always told you about primary sources? The document doesn't tell the whole story, I said. The document tells you where to look next. That's right, he said. And the other thing, context matters more than content. Context matters more than content. He paused. You're not just trying to prove something happened. You're trying to understand why. That's different work. That's harder. A beat. But it's the only kind worth doing. I hung up. I picked up the ring I kept on my nightstand, my mother's college ring, plain gold, worn thin on one side from 40 years of wear. She had given it to me before my first deployment. I put it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. On the night before the inquiry, a car pulled up alongside me while I was walking the perimeter road behind the housing area. Black sedan, civilian plates, engine so quiet I didn't hear it until it was already there. The rear window went down. The man inside wore a gray suit and had the kind of face that was designed to not be remembered. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke. Some situations are better resolved by the people directly involved, he said. Before they become institutional problems. He let that sit in the air. It's worth considering, Captain. The window went back up. The car moved on. It wasn't advice. It was geometry, the shape of what would happen to me if I didn't stop. I kept walking. On the morning of the inquiry, I was the first one in the building. The hearing room was paneled in dark wood that absorbed light and sound in equal measure. 3 senior officers sat behind an elevated table, a brigadier general, a full colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and a civilian oversight representative. The flags behind them stood absolutely still in the recirculated air. Harlan was already seated at the table to my left when I entered. He was in full service dress, ribbon squared, posture correct. He stared straight ahead. He looked like a man sitting in a room he had already decided to survive. The presiding general read the charges. Unauthorized access of restricted materials, conduct unbecoming, insubordination. His voice carried no judgment, purely procedural, the way a doctor reads a diagnosis before explaining the options. "Captain Reeves," he said, "you are invited to make a statement." I stood. I kept my hands at my sides. "I won't dispute the charges," I said. "I accessed materials outside my authorization. I operated outside the established chain. I did both of those things deliberately. I let the admission settle before I continued. I did them because I believed a pilot was dead who should not be dead, and that the record of how he died was being actively suppressed." I looked at the board. My belief was correct. The communications log from Cold Meridian, which has since been removed from the physical archive, documented a clear abort recommendation from Captain Okafor that was overruled at the command level 43 minutes before his aircraft went down. I am prepared to reconstruct that document from memory, in detail, under oath, and to provide the full sequence of events that followed, including the systematic transfer of surviving crew members and the administrative action that was taken against me when my investigation was detected. I sat down. I had one more thing, and I held it until the room had processed everything else. "I also want to note," I said, "that I am not submitting a recommendation for court-martial or separation." That got their attention. I slid my written report across the table. "My recommendation is in the final section." The presiding general read it without expression. Then he looked up and turned to Harlan. "General Harlan," he said. Response. Harlan was still for a long moment. Then slowly he stood. He didn't look at the board. He looked at me. His face had a quality I hadn't seen in it before, something that had been held in compression for a long time and had finally, irrevocably, given way. "Captain Reeves's account is accurate," he said. The room didn't make a sound. It was the specific, dense silence of 30 people simultaneously recalibrating something they thought they understood. "Okafor told me the weather was unsurvivable," Harlan said. His voice was controlled but stripped of all its authority, the way a hull sounds after the pressure inside equalizes. I overruled him. I had a timeline. I had a general officer watching the mission. I made a decision based on what I needed, not on what was true. He set both hands flat on the table. And then I spent 18 months making sure no one found out, including making sure this officer, he looked at me, didn't get close enough to find out either. A pause. "That is all." He sat down. The room processed that in silence for what felt like a full minute. Then the presiding general looked down at my report. He read my recommendation. He read it again. He looked up. "All charges against Captain Reeves are dismissed," he said. Then, turning to Harlan, "The board will review the recommendation in full. We will convene again in 72 hours with a formal determination." He closed the folder. "This hearing is adjourned." I had walked into that room not knowing if I would walk out still wearing a uniform. I walked out with all of it intact. The rank, the record, the call sign, and something else that was harder to name. A kind of stillness that I had not felt since the night I landed in the Euphrates Valley and got 6 people out of a burning aircraft. Not victory. Not relief. Something quieter. The feeling of having held on to the stick all the way through. The formal determination came 3 days later. Harlan was reduced 1 grade to Brigadier General, removed from command and assigned to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He would develop and teach a new required course for junior officers on command ethics, decision-making under pressure, and the legal and moral responsibilities of authority. My recommendation, adopted word for word. Dana Park's transfer to Alaska was reversed the same afternoon the determination came through. She called me from the parking lot, voice bright, slightly wrecked with relief. I found Harlan in the hallway outside his former office 2 days later. He was carrying a box, a photograph, a few books, a coffee mug with the squadron patch on the side. He looked diminished, the way buildings look after a fire, structurally present but somehow smaller than their footprint. He stopped when he saw me. For a moment neither of us spoke. The hallway stretched out behind him, full of history he had tried to control and couldn't. "Reeves," he said. "Sir," I said, "I owe you more than an apology." He shifted the box in his arms. Okafor was my best pilot, I knew that. I knew it that night, and I sent him anyway. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and in his face I could see something I hadn't expected to find there. Not defiance, not the performance of remorse, but the plain, exhausted fact of a man who had been living inside a terrible thing for 18 months and was only now, finally, setting it down. Annapolis has nothing on what West Point is going to do to me. Good, I said, not unkindly. He looked at me. You could have ended my career completely. I know. Why didn't you? I thought about my father. About context mattering more than content. About the work that is harder but worth doing. Because Okafor deserved more than your disgrace, I said. He deserved a lesson, and you're the only person on earth who can teach it. Something moved through his face. Not absolution. I wasn't offering that, and he wasn't asking for it. Something more like recognition. He nodded once. Picked up his box. Walked down the hall. I stood there for a moment listening to his footsteps fade. Then I went back to work. The months that followed had a different texture. The whispers that once trailed me through the hallways became something else. Not awe exactly. More like the particular, calibrated respect that forms when people understand that they have been in the presence of something that chose restraint when it could have chosen destruction. Dana made squadron lead within the year. Torres sent me a photo of his daughter at her soccer tournament, holding a trophy over her head with both hands. I was promoted to Major 14 months after the hearing. The presiding general called me into his office on a Tuesday and told me the Air Force was establishing a new command climate assessment program for all wings, a mandatory curriculum focused on ethical decision-making, accountability in the chain of command, and the particular moral pressures that mount at altitude and darkness, with lives attached to every call. He pushed a folder across the desk. On the cover, in clean block letters, were two words, the W a Wraith and a Tentative. My call sign, the one Okafor's crew had given me 3 years earlier, when I flew a route through a surface-to-air threat envelope that the mission computer had said was not survivable, and came home anyway. The name I had carried quietly ever since. The one Harlan had tried to use to paint me as reckless. The general looked at me the way men look when they know they're correcting something that should have been right from the beginning. We'd like you to head it, he said. Many years later, I was standing in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, in a hall that smelled of metal and history and the specific, high, thin silence of things that have been to the edges of the sky and come back. My hair was grayer at the temples. My hands, which had spent decades on throttle and stick, were still. Suspended above me was a full-scale display of the A-10 configuration I had flown out of Bagram. The call sign was stenciled on the fuselage in white letters. Wraith One. I stood there for a long time. Colonel Reeves? I turned. A young woman, mid-20s, second lieutenant's bar on her collar, posture already trained to something permanent. She had a familiar quality that I couldn't immediately place. I'm Lieutenant Amara Okafor, she said. My uncle was James Okafor. My breath went still. She was smiling, but her eyes held the particular weight of someone who had grown up with a specific absence in the room at holidays and graduations. My family wanted me to find you, if I ever could. My father, James's brother, he said you never let them forget that what happened to James mattered, that the truth of it stayed on the record, not buried. She paused. He said you could have walked away, that you didn't have to dig for it. I had to, I said. Why? I thought about a November night over Syria. About a weather report and a commander and a decision that took 43 minutes to become irreversible. About the way some truths stay in the ground until someone decides the cost of leaving them there is higher than the cost of bringing them up. Because he told command the sky wasn't safe, I said, and they told him to fly anyway. And the least that was owed to him was that someone remembered that he was right. Amara Okafor stood there in the gray light of the museum for a moment, and then she nodded. The kind of nod that doesn't need anything added to it. As I walked out into the afternoon, the sky over Dayton was wide and pale and still. It had that quality that skies have in October when the light is horizontal and everything casts a long shadow. Ancient, unhurried, indifferent to everything except exactly what it is. They called me Wraith One because I flew through places that were supposed to be unsurvivable. But I never flew through any of those places as hard as I flew through that briefing room on my first day at Langley, when a man with stars on his collar looked at me and saw nothing worth reading. I survived that too, and I brought everyone home, even the ones who tried to keep me from landing.